Okay, so let's get started learning the behind the scenes of React. So here I am in the central React directory where we are keeping all of our course projects. And in here, I want to create a new directory. On a Mac in the terminal, I can use the mkdir command, make directory, and I'm going to call this folder behind the scenes. If you're on a Windows computer, you can always open up your Windows File Explorer and create the folder manually if this approach does not work. But I'm going to make a behind the scenes folder. I'm going to navigate into that new directory, and then in here, I'm going to open up VS Code. So code dot, and that's going to bring up VS Code. I'll make that a little bit larger. So right now our directory is empty. In here, I'm going to generate an index.html file. So we're going to start very bare bones and work our way up to an understanding of what exactly React does for us. So I'll create an index.html file. And in VS Code, we actually have a super helpful extension called Emmet. And Emmet can help us generate what are called snippets. And snippets are just pre-written chunks of code. So if you're in an HTML file in VS Code, you can press the exclamation point, which is Shift-1, and you'll notice this helpful menu will pop up. And what both of these options are just pre-existing snippets or chunks of code. So if I select this first one right here and press Enter, we'll immediately have a bare bones HTML file with an HTML tag, a head tag, a body tag, etc. So there are a couple of things that I want to do here. The first, for the title, we can change this from document to something a little bit more helpful, like React behind the scenes. And then inside our body, what I want to do is add a very simple div. And to this div, I will add an ID of root. So while this is a common convention in a React app, there is nothing specifically React-y in this index.html file. It's just a basic div with an ID of root. Okay, so there's a couple things I want to do before we launch this in our browser. The first is to configure some project settings just to make sure we have things like prettier enabled. For me, it's really helpful to see the code very nicely formatted. So what I'm going to do is press Command-Shift-P on a Mac. On a Windows, this is going to be Control-Shift-P. And here you can search for Preferences or Settings. And you'll see here this option, Preferences, Open Settings UI. That's the one we want. And that is going to bring up these settings for VS Code. Immediately, I want to make sure I click on Workspace because I want these settings applied only to this directory or this current project that we're in. I don't want it to accidentally overwrite your global settings. So make sure you select Workspace. And in here, we're going to do a couple changes. You don't have to follow along with any of these if they're not your preferences, but they are generally good things that I like to follow. So right here, you'll notice under commonly used, there's going to be an autosave option. You can also search for autosave in case it doesn't show up. And I'm immediately going to select on focus change. So whenever I, for example, click out of the window or the file that I'm editing, VS Code will automatically save that. The next thing for me is I want to also add a font size here to make it a little bit larger, just so it's easy for you to see. So right here, I'm going to bump my font size from 12 to 16. I'm also going to look for tab size. I'm going to make that 2 pixels because that is consistent with prettier as well as common JavaScript conventions. And then finally, for the formatting, there's 2 things we need to do. The first is to ask our formatter to format on save. Basically, whenever we save the file, we want to run our formatter, which will be prettier. So if you search formatter on save, you'll see this first option, editor format on save. We're going to select that. And then finally, we can search for the actual formatter that we want VS Code to use. And right here, if you search default formatter, you'll see this dropdown. And in here, assuming you have the Prettier extension installed, which you should have done a couple lessons ago in the course, you should see this Prettier option. And even though we don't have a formal Node project with the Prettier NPM plugin installed, this should still work. So I can select Prettier right here. And now you'll notice in our VS Code directory right here, there's going to be a settings.json file. These were all automatically generated. And in here, we're going to have our settings that we just configured listed out. So just to make sure this is working, I'm going to head to index.html and save this file. And immediately you saw Prettier formatted those elements, indented them, just made the file a lot more pleasing to look at. The next thing I want to do, in case you do not have it installed, is go to the extensions box right here. And I'd like you to search for an extension called Live Server. And if you search for it, it should be one of the top results here. You can see it has over 23 million downloads. What live server is going to do is it's going to open up a given index.html file, or any HTML file for that matter, in a web browser. And as you make changes to that HTML file, it's going to reload those changes in your browser. And that's just a more comfortable developer experience so that we don't have to go into our browser and refresh the page whenever we make changes to our HTML file. So it's very similar to the comfort we've had within React, but this is built into VS Code for plain HTML files. You don't need to have a React project per se to use live server. So once you've had this installed in a given HTML file, you can right click here and you're going to see an option that says open with live server. I'm going to press that button and we're going to launch a web browser with the given HTML page. So right now there's nothing here, but if I open up my console and bring this up, you can always right click, by the way, and click inspect to get to where I am. Under elements, you're going to see the div with an ID that we just wrote. In fact, you can see we actually have a typo here. Instead of root, I have roots, but not a problem. That's actually a perfect use case to show you how live server works. So if I move my editor to the left and change this to root and save, you'll notice the live server will auto reload the page. So now we have our div with an ID of root. So as we make changes here in our HTML, the browser will automatically refresh and show us the changes here. All right, so we have our div, we have an empty HTML document, otherwise just the bare bones essentials, and that's all we're gonna need in order to start. So what we're gonna do moving ahead or forward in the lessons is we're going to explore some of the basic mechanics that the browser gives us to create and add new elements to the page, to customize existing DOM elements on the page, and then we're gonna show you how React does the exact same thing, and then finally how JSX is kind of the nice convenience layer that abstracts away a lot of those core JavaScript and React mechanics from us. All right, so we're going to take things step by step. Right now, we have a very basic HTML file. Here's another typo behind the scenes. Once all this is ready to go, then we're good to proceed, and I will see you in the next lesson.